5 years ago, I put out a lesson video about the 7-string guitar and a few of my approaches to practicing chords and practicing scales that involve using that extra string. To this day, I continue to get a lot of comments from that video, and besides the one that are telling me that I'm out of tune, I also get a lot of comments saying that they benefited greatly from that video. So what I wanted to do today was bring a little bit of an updated version of that video that involves the 8th string. Today I'm going to go over as many approaches as I could think of how you can approach the 8th string, besides, the standard approach of just banging on the low string. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It sounds cool. It's fun to do that. But it's also good to do other stuff that involve like bigger chord shapes that involve those low strings, or just ways to combine all the strings together that make it so you're not just playing a 6th string with a few extra fancy strings. I also wanted to make this video because I see that there's a bit of a rise of the use of very low tunings in lots of different styles of music. But with more of the buzz going around with 8 strings and using low tunings, I want to give my take on some alternative ways to practice the 8th string and to give those who are just starting out as much information as possible to transition from 6th string or even 7th string onto the 8th string. I think the first thing to talk about would be tuning. What in the world do we tune all these strings to? So the basic logic of standard guitar tuning for 6-string guitars is that the guitar is mostly tuned in fourths. So we all probably know the thickest string on a standard 6th string is E. From E, we just think, okay, E, F, G, A. That gets us the next string, which is A string. A, B, C, D. Next string is D. D, E, F, G. Next string is G. The next set of strings is where the pattern breaks. We have G, A, B. The next string is a B string. As opposed to being a fourth like the other strings, the distance between a G and a B is actually a major third, which means they're just a tiny bit closer compared to all the others. That's why when you're tuning a guitar, you can always check the next string by using the 5th fret of the previous string until you get to the B. There you have to go down to the 4th fret because they're a little bit closer together than the others. And then B is a 4th away from E. So for the 7th string guitar and the 8th string guitar, typically standard tuning is considered to be the 7th string being B and the 8th string being F sharp. B is a 4th lower than E, and then an F sharp is a 4th lower than B. Some players also like to drop tune that F sharp down to a low E, so it gets you essentially a whole octave lower than the standard 6-string guitar. For chord shapes, it's a little bit nicer because you could just play those drop tune power chords. From there, of course, you have all your other drop tunings. You can continue lowering it by half steps to get lower tunings. But with all these strings, you can also be a little bit experimental with it. I know Josh Travis, when he was playing with Tony Danza, well, not the Tony Danza, but Tony Danza, the band, he would play in the tuning E, B, E, B, E, F sharp, B, E. So a bit of an open tuning. You could definitely experiment with open tunings or something different if that feels a little bit more natural to you. The tuning I typically use on 8th string is actually a little bit unusual. It's the same tuning I use to record stuff with Remnants of Humanity, as well as most of the 8-string songs that I've written and released here on YouTube. So the tuning I typically use is I have the low string tuned down to a C sharp, and then I go to a G sharp for the 7th string, and then I have D sharp, G sharp, C sharp, F sharp, A sharp, and D sharp. As I've gotten used to this tuning, I actually really like it a lot. One, because the bottom 6 strings are just 6-string tuning, so I can play all my regular scales the same way. But also the top 5 strings kind of form a mirror, how it's like C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, G sharp, C sharp. It's kind of similar to the 5-string Jacob Collier tuning, which I had no idea at the time when I was making this up. So it basically allows you to play chord shapes like those really comfortable chord shapes that you wouldn't expect to be able to play in this kind of tuning. Moving forward on this video, I'm going to change my guitar tuning to more of a standard tuning, and I will let you know when it's standard and when it's dropped, because that's going to affect what kind of chord shapes we can learn on this instrument. So first I'm going to talk about the single note approach, which is probably the first thing most people do when they pick up an 8 string anyway. For this part of the video, I'm going to be sticking to standard tuning, but I'm also going to be a half step down, so half step standard tuning. Just be aware that everything I play is going to sound a half step lower than whatever you play, but this would be the same tuning as if I had this string, the 8th string is F sharp, the next string is B, and then standard for the rest. There's a very practical reason why it's very common for 8th string players to focus mostly on single notes rather than chords, and it's because when you play chords this low in the register, especially if you're working with a lot of distortion, it just gets so muddy and so unclear, you can't even tell what kind of chords those are. Those were major chords. You can get away with playing power chords. They're pretty clear enough, but for the most part, you want to be very careful about what kind of chords you play. Later on in the video, I'll show you some chord shapes that actually get around that idea. But when we're focusing on single notes, the main thing I would recommend to practice is to practice playing all of the scales you know, no matter what they are, starting on the 8th string and going all the way up to the high E string. So I'll give you a major shape, a minor shape, as well as a pentatonic shape just to get you started. So for major, if we start on the 5th fret of the 8th string, major scale would look and sound like this. Minor scale would look like this. Last one I want to show you is a pentatonic shape, which actually leads into the standard pentatonic shape first position that every guitar player knows anyway. So it would be essentially the F sharp pentatonic, and we're going to start on the low string because that's an F sharp, or in this case F for me because I'm in half step. We're going to play open 3-5 on the 8th string, followed by 2nd fret and 5th fret on the B string. And then the rest is just your typical pentatonic scale. So it would look like this. It's good to know these scales because it gives you more options than just focusing on only playing that low string. Maybe instead you can go like... You know, I'm just playing around with the pentatonic scale, but it gives you a lot more options. You definitely want to practice string skipping a lot too, because you have so many strings to work with. It's good to be able to skip around the strings to come up with different ideas. And of course you always have the option to be in a drop tuning as well, which I just drop tuned my guitar. So when you're in drop tuning, just be aware that all your scale shapes on the 8th string are going to be offset by 2 frets. So in this case, if I wanted to play that same major scale that's originally started on the 5th fret, I'll now play it on the 7th fret. And then I'm just going to jump down to the 4th fret to play the rest of it. You can also play this little modified pentatonic shape where I basically just leave out one of the notes on the 8th string, but it's a nice comfortable scale to play anyway if you're in a drop tuning. For chords, like I said, we want to be careful about playing too many notes close together in the low register because then it makes our chords sound muddy. So what we could do instead is play chords where we play a low bass note and then we have the other notes kind of spread out so that they don't get too close to that bass note. So I can play chord shapes like this. If you watch my other video about the 7-string chords, those same chords actually work perfectly on the 8-string and standard tuning as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and review all of those really quickly, starting with the major triad. And I'm going to invert it. And then invert again. For minor triads, it's a little more awkward, but we could make it work. And then, of course, it's useful to be able to play a chord scale like that. So that'd be major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminish, which looks like this, back to major. When we're in a drop tuning, we can actually use what we know about bar chords. So here's just a standard bar chord starting on 5th fret of the E string. Because of this tuning, you could just bar all the way down to the 5th fret, and you just have this giant major chord with all 8 strings. If you want to make it minor, we just take the 3rd, which is on the G string, bring it down 1 fret, and now it's minor. Although there might be some moments where we don't want to play all those additional notes, so what we can also do is use those triad shapes we used before in standard tuning. Before it looked like this, but because we're in drop tuning, we're going to have to bring that up to 5th fret on the 8th string. Then we get this. Something that's unique that we could do because we're in drop tuning is we could take the inversion of this. So now I'm going to start over here on 9th fret, E, the 3rd of the chord. And before we had to, in standard tuning, we had to play the 3rd in the bass, which is also a good shape here. But we can also play this with the root in the bass. You just have to stretch a little bit. And if you want it to be minor, you just take that pinky, bring it down 1. So I actually really like that voicing a lot. And then if we take that up in inversion again, we could also do the same thing with this major chord. We could keep the 3rd in the bass here, but have this 2nd inversion triad up here. It gets a little difficult trying to do that with the minor shape. Not very possible there. It's not very easy to grab in the middle of playing. So for minor shapes, we'll probably just have to stick to this. And that's the major chord. Now the last chords I want to show involve playing lots of lower notes. So for these voicings, you don't really want to go too low with it. But if I go to, let's say, the 7th fret, obviously we play power chords. We just have these 1-finger power chords. We could add the 3rd on the E string pretty easily. So if we want to play a major chord, we put our pinky all the way to 11th fret E. And that essentially gets us kind of a spread triad. The root, the 5th, and the 3rd. And then if you want to make it minor, you just lower that pinky 1. And then the last chord I want to show is actually a spread triad, but with the 3rd in the bass. So let's say we're playing a power chord on the 8th fret of the B string. So we got those 2 notes, 8th fret and 10th fret. You can add 7th fret on the 8th string, and that'll give you the 3rd of that chord. So in this case, it'd be a major chord. And then if you want to make it minor, again, you just lower that 3rd by 1. Right, now we're going to get into some of the more extended chords, the 7th chords and the 9ths, the sharp 11s, the 13ths, etc. Ironically, I kind of find these chords a little bit easier to play. They're a little bit less spread out compared to the triads. So let's start off by learning our bass 7th chords, which you should always memorize 4 bass 7th chord types. Major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, and half diminished 7, or minor 7 flat 5 if you're a jazz player. So let's start with the major 7. So I'm going to go to the 8th fret of the 8th string. By the way, I'm in standard tuning again, so these are not drop tune chords. I'll get to the drop tune chords in a little bit. So we have this triad, which looked like this, and if we remember our music theory, we know major 7th chords is a major triad, which is this, but we have a major 7th. So to find a major 7th, we have this note on the pinky is an octave above the root, so we just take that note, bring it down 1/2 step, that becomes a major 7th. And we get a major 7th chord. And what's really cool is once you learn this voicing, this is like your bass, and then if you want to add other notes, so let's say like the 13, we know this note is the 5th, so we're going to bring that up 2 frets, that becomes the 13th, and this would be a major 7 with the 13. You want to do a sharp 11, again this is the 5th, so you just bring it down 1. We could also add a few extra notes if we just bar down the 7th fret on the D, G, and B strings. Get some higher notes in there. That doesn't really add any upper extensions, but it just sounds nice to add the higher notes. If we add those higher notes and also add the 7th fret of E, we get a 9th in there as well, so this is like a major 7 with a 9. To go to a dominant 7th sound, keep this major 7 shape, and a dominant 7 is a major triad with a flat 7. So we know this is the major 7, where my ring finger is, so we're just going to lower that to the 8th fret, and now it's a dominant 7. And then all the same things with extensions apply. Obviously you have your more extreme extensions, so you can have your sharp 11, you can have that 13, you can have the flat 13. If we do a little searching, we could get a flat 9 there. And that also applies for the sharp 9. Going back to the bass dominant 7 shape, to get minor 7, we basically just take this shape and we lower the 3rd. The 3rd is my pinky, so that goes down to 8th fret. And then same process if you want a minor 13, or a minor 7 with 13. If we want a minor 7 with a 9, we could do this. Or we can make it a sus4. And then the last one, half diminished, we basically just take this shape, the minor 7 shape, and just lower that D string note. That one's really only going to be used if you actually play jazz music, but it's good to know anyway. And then once you memorize those, I recommend practicing them in chord scales, because it really helps you see where all the shapes are in any given key. Now for drop tune chords. So for drop tune triads, we have this shape. I'm going to start on the 8th fret of the 8th string. And if we want to get a major 7, same logic, we find the octave, which is now going to be where my pinky is here. So we're going to find a way to play 7th fret of E instead. And we get this shape. Now this is kind of awkward to play. So what we can do is actually get rid of this note. This is just the 5th, so it's not really that important in the whole chord. So if we get rid of that, we end up with the root, the major 7, and then the 3rd here. And this is actually really nice and easy to play, just 3 notes. And then same thing with the other tuning, we could just find all our extensions with this as the bass. If you want a 13, you can actually just bar down the D string on the 7th fret and you get this. So if you want to add your sharp 11, we can actually make this 7th fret the 9th fret on the A string. We could skip the D string and then actually add a major 3rd right here on the 9th fret of G. A little bit more spread out. One voicing that I really like is I'll take this major 7th, bring it up an octave. Since it's the same note, it still works. And then I'm going to add the 9th here with my pinky, 10th fret on the E string. I find it to be really nice, and it's not extremely hard to play. From here, we can figure out our minor 7 shapes pretty easily in drop tuning, as opposed to the major 7, where we have the 7th fret on E and A strings. We're just going to lower that to the 6th fret, while keeping the root the same. Here, I know there's a 13 on the 7th fret of D. We get a minor 13, or add 13. From here, we have the 11 on the 8th fret of the A string. So from there, we could play this like minor 7 sus4 with a 13 sound. If we rearrange the notes a little bit, we could start off with this minor triad shape that I showed earlier. And then we can actually bar down the notes on the 8th fret of A and D strings. And then with that, we essentially get a minor 7 with an additional 11. You could actually just bar down all the notes to get something interesting with that. And then, of course, we could take that major 9 shape that we had before, just lower 2 of the notes, and now we have the minor 9 shape. So even in drop tunings, there's all these kinds of chord shapes that you could do that you weren't able to do before in the standard tuning, but you could apply these shapes to the 7th string as well. And lastly, of course, you want to find a way to be able to play a chord scale, just like with all the other shapes that we've been learning. So we start off with major 7. It's going to sound not too good down here, but for the sake of practice, it's still good to do. Yeah, our dominant shape right here, basically it's going to be like the minor 7 shape, but you add the 9th fret on the A string. Just as a little bonus, I also wanted to show a little bit of thumping. Thumping on guitar is essentially just slap bass, but on guitar. It's very commonly done on 8-string guitar, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have an 8-string to do it. You could do it on 7-string, a 6-string, or whatever. So basically the way I think of thumping is first, we don't use a pick at all. You're gonna give a thumbs up, and depending on the anatomy of your finger, I know Tosin Abasi's thumb goes straight up at a 90-degree angle, which is insane. Mine doesn't go quite as far. I've met some people where the most they can go is like this, but depending on what your finger anatomy is, you want to try to adjust your playing style based on how well your finger can reach the string. And what I do is I aim to hit this corner of my fingernail on my thumb against the string. And you want to hit it and immediately rest your thumb on the string below. So it'll look like that. That's what you want to get used to first. Once you get that down, you could do these little percussive hits like this. So you play the open string, hit with your left hand, and then go up with your thumb. So I'm going down, hit, up. You get 3 hits there. And eventually you just increase the speed gradually like that. From there, you could start adding these fingers to get more percussive hits. So you can get 4 by going 1, hit, 3, 4 with the first finger. And then you could add the next finger to get 5 hits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not super good with the ring finger yet, but you can get 6 hits if you add that. Then, of course, you want to do that with all the strings. So you want to get used to hitting the lowest string you have, maybe the next string. And a great song to learn to get used to this movement is Infinite Regression, is that main riff. You'll want to adjust to the thinner strings because I find it a little more challenging to hit the thinner strings than the thicker strings. That's probably why it's more commonly done on 8-string. But once you get used to it, you can come up with a lot of cool stuff. So that is it for today. That is pretty much most of the things that I have figured out on the H string over the years in standard tuning, in drop tuning, and like I said, you can experiment with different tunings, whatever other sounds you feel are comfortable for you to play. What's kind of cool about the H string guitar, it isn't as standardized as the 6 string guitar, so there's definitely a lot of room for experimentation and just finding your own sound with it. But that's it for me. I will catch you all in the next video. Later.